There's a relatively well-known bug in Super Smash Bros. Melee, which you might have seen before. If you stand on the platforms just right, the CPUs will just sit there. They will wait for you to move before ever moving themselves, in a strange act of protest, refusing to interact with you unless you interact with them also. There is a horrible secret in Melee, one which is spoken about in whispers, a terrible truth which we try to forget whenever anyone reminds us. The secret is that we are not so different from these poorly coded CPUs. And if you play your cards just right, you'll find that the CPU standstill bug works on people too.
To understand the story, we will first need to learn to find our way in the darkness. We will need to understand the fundamental forces that govern the Melee community, and we will need to descend into the bizarre rabbit hole of tournament matches which directly challenge those very fundamental forces altogether. We need to study our map carefully, so we can become that much more painfully aware that a map is just a rough approximation of reality. A fighting game's rule set is often the only thing keeping a community from devolving into madness. Look at some of the biggest fighting games and you'll see that developers painstakingly craft their rule sets to be clear and unwavering. Street Fighter V, best of 3, 99-second rounds. Tekken 7, best of 5, 60-second rounds. And Super Smash Bros. Melee is no different. Time battle, 2 minutes. But if you've played any Melee outside of a free-to-enter dorm tournament, you'll know the community has shouldered the responsibility of crafting the rule sets onto themselves. The Melee rule set we know is clear, simple, and very different from what was packaged by Nintendo. 4 stocks, 8 minutes, and only using 6 of the 29 stages. In some sense, the esport of Melee is a strict subset of the actual game, some arbitrarily defined construct embedded in the wacky party game world, crafted to be as legitimate as possible. But another hidden rulebook exists in the hearts of some Melee players. Underneath the clearly enumerated rules, you'll find gentlemen's agreements, the unwritten rules of Melee. It could be giving your opponent a homie stock, or it could be playing on a mutually agreed upon stage, even after the rules would otherwise require you to play somewhere else. We even sometimes see character-specific gentlemen's agreements. Sheik players may agree to not chain grab each other, in hopes of playing a fun, combo-oriented game instead of a boring, grab-centered one. There's all sorts of these types of mutual agreements. And these rules, despite not being rules, absolutely must not be fucked with. Mew2King is one of the most recognizable players in Melee's history. He is a beloved player known for many things. His ruthless punish game, his methodical edgeguarding, and his self-described optimal playstyle. Sometimes it's optimal to break Melee's fake rules. At Shine 2017, Mew2King played against Shroomed, another top Sheik player.
I think it's going to be Sheik dittos. Generally, he plays Sheik against Sheik, unless there's chain grabs. So we don't chain grab each other, so I'm pretty sure we're going to Sheik ditto. Okay.
But after going down 2-1, one game away from losing, Mew2King informed Shroom that he would begin using chain grabs for the remainder of the set, eventually winning. People absolutely lost their minds over this. You won't get disqualified for breaking one of these rules, but nobody would make the mistake of saying breaking them comes with no consequences. So we've seen that sometimes Melee's rules extend past what's explicitly on the rule set, but sometimes they can even extend further than any spoken agreement. Sometimes we as players are under the understanding that there are rules that are unspoken, a contract we lock ourselves into when we plug in our controllers and hit start. Sometimes we assume the simplest idea of a fighting game, the act of fighting and hitting your opponent, is understood between both players. But this isn't always true. Mew2King is no stranger to these types of incidents. In April 2017, he played against Westballz, a player against whom he is undefeated. Mew2King wins the off-stream set, last stock, Game 5, having to make a last-second comeback to snatch the victory.
What the
When they play again 2 months later at Saints Gaming Live, Mutaking is prepared. Once again, we arrive at a Game 5 situation, but Mutaking has a plan this time. He will grab the ledge, and he will stay there. In Melee, a character can grab the ledge and gain a small window of invincibility where their opponent is not able to damage them or knock them away. There's nothing stopping anyone from doing this again and again. The game doesn't care. It will give you the same number of invincibility frames on your first grab as it will for your 100th. The only thing forcing you to get off the ledge is the tacit agreement between you and your opponent that you will be playing the same game together. As far as the elite players go, Mutaking is one of the ones you occasionally see from time to time employing one of these frowned upon strategies. Mutaking has made a career off of abusing ledge mechanics in this game, with many community in-jokes and iconic moments coming from him reversing a top player from the ledge.
On his throne, and
that's it.
the ledge, and it's over! Three
over.
stocks!
Mutaking knows the ledge is broken, and he is in favor of adding rules which diminish his power, but only for characters he doesn't play. In fact, he's gone so far as to use himself as a hostage, implying he would quit if a ledge grab limit was added to the rule set. Westballz has absolutely no idea what to do against Mutaking sledge camping.
Dude, you just stayed in one spot. Shut up. Empty space for like a minute. Why would you do that?
I went to the other side of the stage to let you get back on, and you just stood there for another 2 minutes.
Dude, you didn't even try to take the ledge from me.
Why would I? That's a bad risk.
He just stays on the ledge until the timer runs out, and Mutaking was crowned the winner of their set. Sometimes we're willing to give up our own advantage to just get back to what we think is the real game. Sometimes this doesn't change anything. Sometimes you get so mad that you complain about it to a bartender who has no idea what you're talking about.
Just go do something that you can't do anything about, which is if you grab the ledge on the stage, you get invincibility.
But being mad doesn't mean that you're immune to doing these things yourself. Westballz has been around a long time. He's one of only 22 players to be on every single iteration of the Melee Top 100. He's been around long enough to know that things like this are still in the game. They exist, and at least as far as the current metagame goes, they don't really have answers. And every so often, Westballz will try his hand at using them himself. At the Big House 4, Westballz is looking dominant versus Armada. He has never beaten Armada, but you wouldn't know it by game 1. Westballz hops up to the top platform and refuses to come down, except with the occasional stray laser. Peach can't reach the top platform, except by expending her very slow double jump, which puts Peach in a somewhat vulnerable position. Armada, the greatest player to ever touch a GameCube controller, absolutely crumbles in the face of this strategy, and he's reduced to pulling turnips in hope that he can pull a Stitch Face, a rare turnip which does tons of damage. If you were to put this position to a chess engine, it would probably tell you that this is completely one position for the Falco player. All Westballz has to do is stay on the top platform until the timer runs out, and since he has more stocks than Armada, it will be his victory. The problem is that the timer is 8 minutes long, and most players find the idea of doing nothing for 8 minutes to be extremely, extremely boring. It is for this reason that the timer is mostly a hilariously unimportant technicality in the rule set, despite how dramatic the game's timeouts usually are. Its only real purpose is to serve as the arbiter for when two players really don't feel like playing each other. Most games don't last 8 minutes. Most games barely last 3 minutes. Thanks to Fizzy's Project Slippy, we can actually check how useless the timer is in a typical tournament. At Pound 2019, in a sample of just over 11,000 replays, the timer reached 0 in just 0.19% of them. Among these, only a single actual game reached time. Zane vs. Tuba in Game 5 of Winner's Quarters. All the rest were abandoned warm-up setups. Seeing the timer strike 0 is genuinely a 1 in 10,000 event. There's occasionally talk about lowering the timer to make timeout situations go by quicker, which is always a hot topic on social media whenever someone brings it up every 4 months or so. Royal Flush, a 2017 New Jersey major, controversially adopted a 7-minute timer instead of an 8-minute timer, and absolutely nothing of interest happened. There was no great shift towards timeout strategies, and as far as I could tell, none of the games played deep in bracket actually hit time trouble. Melee players travel to tournaments to play the game together, and in virtually every set they play, they go out of their way to play the game as much as possible. Westballz, with his incomprehensible lead over Armada, is, at the end of the day, just another melee player. He finds this just as boring as you or I do, and halfway through game 1, he cracks and starts playing normally again.
This VOD, please don't waste 5 minutes of my time camping the platform, and then the last stock, you're gonna run at the guy?
Westballz played 10 more sets with Armada before the Peach player's retirement in 2018. Westballz won just 4 out of the 34 games. It's possible that with a short enough timer, players like Westballz could use these strategies without as easily getting bored, but nobody particularly wants to do that. Sometimes you know what you need to do to win, and sometimes you can't bring yourself to it. Sometimes the unwritten rules of Melee are so powerful that they make us actively throw ourselves into the jaws of defeat. And sometimes winning doesn't even matter. Sometimes there's more to a set than the winner or loser.
Wobbling is the only true infinite combo seen in high-level Melee, and is arguably the most controversial thing in the whole game. The Ice Climbers grab their opponent and take turns hitting them to trap their opponent and hit stun indefinitely. In a truly lawless wasteland, any wobble started with at least equal stock count would automatically win. You can just wobble them to 999% and then continue wobbling them until the timer runs out, whereby you win by having lower percent at the end of the match. Clearly, this violates the stalling rule, so the community needed to provide some sort of ruling on what to do about this. The consensus for a while was that this technique should just be banned, until it was re-legalized for EVO in 2013, with the traditional threshold of 300% being the community-defined border between legitimate play and stalling. 300%, for the most part, is just a random, very high number.
And he gets to wobble all the way to 300. That's what I would do.
Is that the rule, 300? I thought it was 200.
I think it's 300. Doesn't matter, the game is over.
It is now, yeah, but that could...
In virtually every other combo in the game, there is a pushing and pulling between the attacker and the attacked, where the attacker needs to pay attention to how their victim is trying to escape in order to continue comboing them. Both players have agency over the situation, and in a very real sense, both players are still playing. With wobbling, there is no such agency, and the victim is largely reduced to waiting around until the wobble ends. As a result, Melee players passionately hate getting wobbled, often enough so that they're willing to stomach using the most detested strategies in Melee to avoid it. As strong as wobbling is, it's only as strong as the character it's attached to. Ice Climbers are considered a borderline top tier. Their ability to infinite every character balanced by their diminished range, reliance on lunges, and weakness against players who make it a point to stay as far away as possible from the Ice Climbers. Appropriately, nobody embodies this as well as our good friend Mutiking, in a set at PAX Arena against Wobbles, the namesake of wobbling itself. Mutiking struggles against the Ice Climbers, and really just wishes they didn't exist. In his set versus Wobbles, he will camp the Ice Climbers in 2 different ways across 2 different characters. At the end of the set, Wobbles grabs Mutiking on the shoulder and tells him, "It's fine if you play that way, but if you ever complain about wobbling again, you are a giant hypocrite." See, this set perfectly captures the 2 dipoles of the wobbling debate. A cohort which hates the Ice Climbers enough to cheer for their destruction by any means necessary, and a cohort which views the Ice Climbers as tragic victims whose opponents have become something far worse than the Ice Climbers players could have ever been. Historically speaking, the wobbling debate was a power struggle between 3 factions of the community: the pro-wobbling party, the pro-ban party, and the I don't care party. For years, these 3 groups enjoyed a relatively stable power balance, with the large cohort of centrists making it impossible for one group to get the advantage over the other. That is, until a beloved top 10 player got his ass kicked by an unranked New Jersey Ice Climbers player, and then took to social media in support of banning the technique. The influence of the I don't care party gradually vanished as they began to be radicalized towards one extreme or the other, a state of affairs obviously unlike anything happening in American current events. The insidious thing about this newly emerging 2-party system is that the figureheads for each party were, of course, acting almost entirely out of self-interest. When the community defines the rules arbitrarily, it turns out that in a sense, complaining on social media counts as gameplay. It was no coincidence that so many of the prominent anti-wobbling crowd absolutely sucked against the Ice Climbers, and it was also no coincidence that so many of the prominent anti-ban crowd were either Ice Climbers players themselves or players whose success would be obviously diminished without the ability to beat up Ice Climbers players in bracket. People largely joined the party that would lead to the best success for themselves as a player, because that's what competitors do. If you wanted Wobbling banned, you were clearly a scrub who wanted to place artificial restrictions on how the game should be played, just like Dave Serlin wrote in Chapter 3 of Playing to Win. If you wanted Wobbling legal, you were obviously a scrub who wasn't even willing to soft pan a technique that would make the game significantly better, just like Dave Serlin wrote in Chapter 6 of Playing to Win. There is no developer patch coming. Wobbling exists in version 1.02 of the NTSC Melee, and it will exist in that version of the game until the heat death of the universe. Like everything else in the history of Melee, whether or not competitive players allow it is a matter that competitive players will have to solve amongst themselves. This all came to a head at Battle of BC 3, an early tournament experimenting with the idea of reverting back to the old days and banning Wobbling. One of the best players in British Columbia was himself an Ice Climbers player named Fauxhebro, and he was furious. He showed up at the event wearing a custom t-shirt with the phrase "Free Foe" on it, a plea to the organizers to let him wobble his opponents. Fauxhebro was a man on a mission, and it isn't a stretch to say that he had what was likely his best tournament ever at this event, even without wobbling. The strength lent to him by his vindictiveness allowed him to brutally stomp on player after player, even triumphing over Commaster, a Luigi player he's played multiple times before and never once beaten, even with wobbling. But it all came to a grinding halt once he ran into Chango, a Jigglypuff player active in Mexico and Washington. Ice Climbers vs Jigglypuff is bad enough with wobbling legal, but with wobbling banned, it's one of those matchups you occasionally hear described as unwinnable. In their set, Chango adopts a straightforward strategy. Step 1. Build a percentage lead. Step 2. Stay really, really far away. There is no Step 3. Fauxhebro manages to fight off Chango in the games where he doesn't let him pass Step 1, but when Chango reaches Step 2, Fauxhebro does not know what to do. And so, he does nothing. Game 5, he just gives up altogether. Chango has successfully set up the CPU standstill glitch on a human opponent. The commentary offers suggestions on how he could challenge Chango on the platform, but Faux is not interested. After all, complaining is a gameplay decision. In any other gaming community, it would be beyond ridiculous to see a competitor make such a dramatic show of their lack of participation, but within Super Smash Bros., this set genuinely could have had broader implications beyond a winner and a loser. At multiple points in the history of Super Smash Bros., players have taken it upon themselves to use their own gameplay to point out the flaws of the rule set. Congo Jungle was a popular stage in competitive play until Pink Shinobi camped Rock Croc in a single game at Genesis 1, which was enough to get the stage banned forever. If Fauxhebro managed to win this set, it probably just would have ended up fodder for pro-ban advocates to say that Ice Climbers don't need wobbling to win. It was probably better in the long run to make his character look as helpless and unviable as possible. Fauxhebro and Chango are not so different in this set. Both of them are doing nothing. Both of them just want to win. Both of them, almost certainly, are not having any fun. With all the pieces assembled, we can finally bring our attention to the rivalry at the end of the universe. Mikel and Bananas, a Chicago Puff player and a Texas Ice Climbers player. These two have what may very well be the worst rivalry in all of competitive gaming. In some sense, you can barely even call it a rivalry, as Mikel has won every game against Bananas in every set they have ever played. Our story begins at the National Melee Arcadian, a tournament which barred any players ranked in the top 100 from entering. At this tournament, two players who have never met are about to play for the first time. For Bananas, the world rank 102 and favorite to win the event, it will be the worst set of Melee he has ever had to play in his entire life. For Mikel, an unknown beast forged in the fires of ranked online play, it will be Sunday. Their set would be played off-stream, at both players' request, so the only footage that remains is cell phone captures of the massive crowd the set drew. It was this set which drew national attention to Mikel as the embodiment of what people feared in Melee, a Jigglypuff player with an unwavering focus on preventing his opponent from playing the game in any capacity.
Are you kidding me? This is amazing.
This is incredible.
Bro, this dog!
It feels so good to not have to cheer against Mikel.
Feels good to cheer for him.
I know, it feels great, dude. I never felt this good. I never felt so happy to see Puff win.
It's having so much fun.
Let's go, Jigglypuff!
Mikel would go on to win the set and later take the entire tournament. By the time they played again at Don't Park on the Grass in late 2018, a lot had changed. Mikel had continued his upward ascent with modest placings and was rewarded by debuting in the top 50 of the Summer MPGR. Bananas, however, was on a different level entirely. Since his loss to Mikel, Bananas became a premier top player with wins over S2J, Nun, Fiction, and even top 5 players like Plup, Mango, and Mewtwo. A month later, he would make history and become the highest debut on a top 100 ever. 9 months after they played their first set, they meet again in a ballroom on the University of Washington's campus. It was here where Melee would face its hardest test, one where all the darkest forces in Melee would meet at the same time. After getting brutally timed out in Game 1, Bananas reveals his final act of counterplay. You might be fooled into thinking that Melee is a game with two outcomes, winning and losing. This is not the case. There is a third, much rarer option. It is possible for both players to be disqualified. Bananas thinks to himself, if he won't approach me, then I won't approach him. If we never approach each other, eventually a TO will have to step in and DQ the both of us. And since Mikel is winning, surely he wouldn't want that. TO walks over and demands that they fight during the one-stock tiebreaker that happens in tied timeout situations. They agree to fight.
If neither of them touches each other, they both get DQ'd. This is a one-stock 3-minute.
Bananas has done the impossible. He has forced a player who is winning to approach him instead of approaching himself. His plan has succeeded.
Oh, he's dead! He's dead! We're gonna have to make a new fucking rule because of this hack. I was just thinking.
Mikel wins the tiebreaker anyways, and goes on to win the set 3-0.
Until the real action starts. I don't know what to do.
I think no. No, you.
This is the endpoint of Melee. This is where it all falls apart. If you look very closely, you'll find that the rules don't actually make any sense at all. In these corner cases, where the best move is to not play the game at all, there is no objective governing body to determine which party is right and which is wrong. Everything is made up, and we are actively continuing to make it up as we go along. The two would play one last time, at Paradigm Shift in July 2019. For a brief moment in Game 2, it seems like Bananas will take a game off of Mikel for the first time. But it's a fleeting moment. Mikel makes a comeback and uneventfully wins the set 2-0. It really just seems like the matchup is impossible. Mikel cannot be defeated. If bananas can't even come close, who could possibly do it? Six days later, Mikel will lose to Boyd, an Ice Climbers player from Ohio. I originally thought the set was unrecorded, but it turns out I was wrong. It's just that nobody wanted to watch it. It's the sort of thing you see once in a lifetime, like the smash equivalent of watching Bartolo Colon hit a home run in slow motion. It's a 5-game set that lasts almost 40 minutes. 2 of the games time out, and 2 others would have timed out had Boyd not thrown himself off stage to concede right before the timer ran out. Somehow, Boyd manages to find 3 wobbles in Game 5 to win the set. It may have been the single most amazing upset that happened through the entirety of 2019, and only 600-something people decided to watch the set. And honestly, who can blame them? Not a single goddamn thing about this video game makes any sense. At the end of the day, Melee is not a huge esport. There are not multi-million-dollar prize pools that incentivize players to pull out all the stops. The top players are unbelievably skilled, but they aren't playing to win by any means necessary. Most players just want to win in their own way, and winning in Melee is typically more about validating your worldview than it is about capturing the glory of victory or whatever. It's certainly true that some people find winning itself to be the fun part, but there's not much that would draw a player like this to Melee specifically, rather than something like League of Legends, Dota 2, Fortnite, or any other esport that values their victory more directly. Melee is probably less fun than we all think it is, but that's okay, because the vast majority of Melee players are just playing the version of Melee that they wish Melee was. Paying attention to the cracks in this facade is when you end up seeing stuff like Chudat deliberately killing himself against Hungrybox so he could get his Nana back. Melee players talk big about how expressive their game is, but they're more right than they realize. For better or for worse, Melee isn't a game which is inherently exciting. The game couldn't possibly capture a person's personality if boring people did not have an avenue to be their boring selves. It wouldn't be self-expression if everyone was forced to act cooler than they really were. Melee is not sick, at least not by itself. People are sick, and Melee lets them show it to the world. The fact that these moments have happened in the game's history, but are astonishingly rare, says far more about people than it does about the game. With that in mind, is there ever a right answer to rule set questions? Should we lower the timer from 8 minutes to make timeout strategies more accessible, even though it could make easier to use potentially character invalidating strategies? Should we add a ledge grab limit, even though characters who abuse the ledge may or may not be the best characters in the game? Should we ban wobbling, even though the ice climbers are probably useless in certain matchups without it? Should we mod the game to remove? Should we add an airtime limit? Even though Julian is effectively set up. Should we legalize the lock-on players? Should we add a mod available for purchase for players who are using Should we add mandatory controller? Should we add a ban invest even though there are random elements that inevitably face the space and okay with? There probably aren't right answers to these questions. Because from the very beginning, the rule set was just an arbitrary subset of the game that we decided was the most fun. In any other competitive game, these things would just be patched in or out based on the developer's will, but for us, we get to decide these things for ourselves. And we don't really like thinking too hard about it. Because Melee is just a thing we do, and the only reason we do it is because it's fun.